Okay, so this is going to be chapter 4. So we're going to be taking a look at tissues. And so first of all, when you take a look at a tissue, it's going to be essentially a collection of cells. And so those cells are going to be fastened together and they're going to have a common uniform function. And so that's the critical thing about the tissues themselves. And so they're going to have a common function to perform. There are 4 major types of tissues in the body. We'll take a look at each one of them. So we have connective tissues. So these are basically going to be a supportive type of a tissue for different types of body parts. Muscular tissue, which basically is your contractile tissue. And then you have nervous tissue, which is the conductive tissue. And then epithelial tissue, which is both a covering of the cavities and also for secretion. So for instance, glands are considered type of epithelial tissue itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at each one in turn. So we're going to take a look at first connective tissue. So basically when you take a look at connective tissue, this is something that's dominated by the extracellular matrix. And so these typically tend to have specialized cells in the extracellular matrix, so which is essentially abbreviated ECM. You're going to have what's called ground substance, which is kind of like a gel-like liquid. In addition to protein fibers. So this is so the ground substance is going to be a gamish of different types of things. For instance, it differs between the different cells. For instance, the consistency will be a little bit different. So for instance, the bone matrix is going to be solid and hard. In a fluid connective tissue like blood, it's a little bit more viscous. But ground substance forms sort of that fluid gel-like background around which you secrete different types of protein molecules and things like that. So when you take a look at your connective tissue, so this is what your extracellular matrix would look like, your ECM. And so you can see on the outside here, you can see there's adipose cells, which is a type of connective tissue. It's called a type of loose connective tissue. In addition to that, you're going to see what's called the fibroblasts. So that's these little long, skinny purple guys. And so these will divide to produce other cells, but they also lay down connective tissue. So like during wound healing and things like that. You'll also have in your connective tissue thick protein fibers. These are called collagen. So they're strong and tough and structural. So if you want to know what pure collagen looks like, just grab your Achilles tendon. So that's about almost pure collagen. So that's very, very tough material. You also have elastic fibers, so elastin, which are these little thin black pieces. So these are very stretchable, kind of like spandex in our clothes, gives us a little bit of flexibility. The fluidy piece that's inside, that's kind of forms the matrix of all this, is the ground substance. So this is that fluid-filled area. You also have a couple of other different types of things going on here. So you have what's called reticular fibers. So these tend to be sort of branched, thin protein fibers that kind of create almost like a scaffold-like network within the extracellular matrix. And then within this, typically, like for instance, your skin, you see white blood cells cruising around in here. They engulf bacteria and things of that nature. And then the last thing you see up here are the stem cells. So the stem cells basically divide, and their job is to produce other cells. So your constant source of new cells is some sort of a stem cell. So when you take a look at your connective tissue, there are 3 main types of protein fibers. The first one is collagen. So this is going to be flexible, but it's going to be strong and tough. And so this is what you want for structure and for durability. Your reticular fibers, which are these little black ones that we saw down here. So those guys are going to be typically thin. They're going to be really branched collagen fibers. And so they're a little bit less tough than the true collagen fibers. So they're kind of a little bit more like a scaffold. Associated with that. And of course, you have your elastic fibers, which is made of a protein called elastin. And so this gives you both stretch and recoil. So it's basically for flexibility. So those are the main types of protein fibers that you see in the connective tissue matrix. Now, the different types of connective tissue that you see, basically it come in three different types. The first one is what's referred to as fibrous, and we'll take a look at that. Then we have supportive, and then we have fluid. So here's kind of what it looks like in terms of a flow chart. This is really a good flow chart, right? So let's start off with our fibrous connective tissues first of all. Your fibrous connective tissues will basically break into two different types. Either you have loose or you have dense. And so generally speaking, this is kind of like packing material. You either have loose packing material for less structural support, or you have dense packing material for more solid structural support. It depends on what kind of mechanical stresses you're going to create on your tissues themselves. Supportive connective tissues can be broken then into cartilage and bone. So bone is solid and has a rigid matrix, so it's very tough. Cartilage, not so much. It's a little more flexible in the terms of its matrix, designed to sort of be flexible. So like, for instance, the tip of your nose is nasal cartilage, so you can kind of move your nose back and forth, and that gives you a little bit of flexibility. But your bones are not designed to be flexible. They're designed to hold heavy loads like your body weight, for instance. And then the fluid connective tissues come in two different types. You have blood, which basically supports the cells in your blood. And then you have lymph, which is another type of connective tissue. And this is going to support your immune cells, like your white blood cells, for instance. And so those are going to be your three main branches of connective tissue. Now let's take a look at each one in turn. So the fibrous connective tissue is either going to, like we said, going to be loose or dense. In both situations, the tissue will contain fibroblasts. Remember, fibroblasts are those cells in your tissues that are responsible for laying down new connective tissue. And so generally speaking, when these guys will start to lay down stuff, they'll start to lay down ground substance, and they'll start to lay down these protein fibers. And so the types of protein fibers that they're going to be laying down, first of all, is either going to be loose. So this is kind of like loose fill. So like whenever you have a tissue, you need some loose filler, you can't just open space. So this is kind of like loose fill. It's less structural in nature. So basically ideal for low mechanical stress tissues. That's low. And so this includes like what's called areolar connective tissue. You got a little bit of everything in areolar. Reticular connective tissue, and what's called adipose tissue. So this is basically our fat tissue. Those are all different types of loose connective tissue. Then you have dense fibrous connective tissue. So this basically is, it's kind of like a more structurally robust filler. And this is for high mechanical stress tissues. So for instance, you'll find this in tendons and ligaments, and you'll find this in two different versions. Let me see here if I'll cover it on chat on slide 13, but this is kind of what it looks like. So here's your loose fibrous tissue. So you can see this like pink collagenous cable right there, these little thin black lines, those are elastic fibers. And of course you can see the nucleus of the fibroblasts. So that gives you that kind of loose fill. This one over here is adipose tissue. So you can see the periphery of the cell membrane, and this is all fat. That's basically a drop of fat that's in there. So that's basically a type of loose fibrous tissue. And they kind of have it organized a little oddly here, but and then your here you can see a dense fibrous tissue. So this is just waves of collagen here. So all of this is collagen. So just waves of collagen. This is what your tendon looks like. So you can see it's basically the tendon associated with this muscle attached to your patella. And so that's true for most tendons and ligaments and things of that nature. Notice where the loose fibrous is coming from. This is probably an example of areolar. So it's just underneath the skin just to kind of pack that so there's no airspace in there. So this is your dense fibrous, which is coming from your tendon. And then your supportives. So you have cartilage, hyaline cartilage, where you can see you've got chondrocytes, which are basically cartilage cells within a little hollow area called the lacuna. And then you have the matrix. That's the actual cartilaginous ground substance, and the proteins. You can see it has kind of this airy brushed look, kind of an airbrushed look. That's true for hyaline cartilage. So that's going to be your articular cartilage in your joints. That's where the hot cartilage is coming from. And then the other supportive type of tissue is compact bone, where you can see, again, lacuna in these like little dark areas. So you have osteocytes inside those little lacuna. And they're the ones who've laid down these concentric rings of bony matrix to create the osteon. So this creates what's called compact bone. And so that's basically what's in this little bony area right here. So that's a type of support. So you can see that any given region of your body is not just one tissue, it's an actual amalgam of multiple tissues. And so when we take a look at our loose fibrous, adipose in particular is our fat storage. And so ultimately, it'll help to sort of buttress the epithelium. So your skin, for instance, will have subcutaneous fat to kind of help bolster it. You also see fat wrapped around your internal organs as well to help protect it from shock. So generally speaking, an adipose tissue doesn't have a whole lot of extracellular matrix to it. It's mostly defined by the cell itself. And the cells themselves are called adipocytes. They're basically cells filled with liquid fat. So you're storing fat in there for insulation, for cushioning, and also for energy as well. And this is typically where you get your fat reserves. So typically your fat reserves are subcutaneous fat reserves in nature. Your dense fibrous connective tissue is basically where you get those waves of collagen fibers like we saw before. And generally speaking, you're going to find those in tendons and ligaments. And actually, you can break your dense fibrous into two different types, either dense irregular, which is like little swirls of collagen, kind of like little pink swirls like this, or you can get dense regular. So this is basically like even waves. So like this more. So dense because you can pack a lot more collagen if you have it in even waves like that. And of course you have your supportive, which is basically your cartilage and your bone. And so these will help with protection, right? So for instance, your bones will protect your organs, also the shape of things, the structure, leverage, and movement. So your bones is basically how you move your body. Cartilage is a little bit more flexible because it is made slightly differently in the sense that it doesn't have mineralization of the matrix. Mineralization is basically what hardens to bone. Okay, so basically cartilage is in some ways similar to bony matrix, but it doesn't have that hardening agent. So typically when you take a look at cartilage, they're going to be driven by the cartilage cells. So these are the cartilage cells. And you have a couple of different types. So you have what's called chondrocytes. Chondros referring to cartilage, cytes, cells. So these are cartilage cells. And so these guys will basically maintain cartilaginous matrix. And then you have the chondroblasts, which basically lay down new matrix. And the chondrocytes basically maintain existing matrix. So the matrix then being very flexible, and so it will kind of be able to bend a little bit to kind of be flexible and things like that. The one thing that's important to learn about cartilage is that it does not have blood supply to it. And as a result, if you damage your cartilage, you're going to be slow to heal. Okay, that's true for bones or other tissues. So there are three different types of cartilage, and they're there for specific reasons. The most common one is the hyaline cartilage. Typically, you have a lot of fine collagenous fibers. Typically, hyaline cartilage is most of what you would identify as cartilage. So for instance, if I asked you point to some cartilage, you point to a joint or maybe your nose, all that is hyaline cartilage. So basically, this is your tip of your nose, the ends of your long bones that's in your joints, your fetal skeleton is mostly cartilage. So it's soft and malleable, basically. And durable. So on the flip side of things, you also have elastic cartilage. So you have a lot of elastic fibers in there. So this is basically very flexible. But not structural. So for instance, your ear, when you kind of crush your ear, that's elastic cartilage. So you can see it's very, very elastic. It bounces right back, but it's not very structural. So you can't stand on your ear. The last one is fiber cartilage, which is the opposite. So you have lots of strong collagen fibers. So this is basically very structural, but not flexible. And so in this case, you have shock absorption. So for instance, your vertebral discs are made out of fiber cartilage. All of your pubic symphysis, which is like a little fiber cartilage plug that is in between your two bones to keep your two pubic bones from clapping together when you walk. And so those are your main types of cartilage. And then we get to our other supportive connective tissue, which is bone. This is the most rigid. It's basically hard and calcified. So like cartilage, the matrix is going to be made up of lots of collagen. It's also going to have some calcium salts in there as well. And then there will be other types of protein fibers in there, similar like rebar in concrete. So a combination of rebar and elastin that's going to be in there. And then from this strategy, we can develop two different types of bony structure. We can create what's called compact bone or spongy bone, which is what it says it is. It's basically looks like a sponge. And so these types of bone are going to be made up of our two bone cells. So the osteoblast, basically what these guys will lay down new matrix called osteoid. The osteoclast typically will break down matrix. Notice you now have two cells, one that builds and one that tears down. You can have that with cartilage. Okay, and then of course you have osteocytes, which are cells that basically maintain existing bone matrix. So when you take a look at the structure of the bones, the compact bones, which we're going to see a picture of here in just a second. Basically, the compact bone is essentially the shaft of a long bone, right? So ultimately, it's made of these sort of cylindrical structures called osteons. We saw a picture of that before. So the osteons start off with a central canal, which is basically the blood vessel that goes through the bone itself and feeds the osteocytes. And then what happens is these osteocytes, which are little bone cells, will basically lay down bony matrix around that central canal, and then they'll lay down a second layer around themselves, but they'll create a little hollowing for themselves. And at this point, the osteoblast turns into osteocyte, so it just maintains existing bony matrix. So we have the central canal with our blood coming through here. And then what happens is more osteoblasts will land on the surface. And then what they'll do is they'll lay down another ring of bone and create a little hollowing for themselves. That's the lacuna. And then in addition to that, in order to be able to get blood from the central canal, what they'll do is they'll basically create these like little appendages, these little kind of fissure-like, almost crack-like tunnels that goes through the bony matrix and then connects to the central canal so they can get blood to these outermost osteocytes. So these guys are what's called canalicula. Little tiny canals. And so that's kind of what compact bone is made out of. And the spongy bone is basically at the ends of long bones. So when you take a look at it, it's made out of these long sort of kind of crisscrossing what's called trabecula that creates these sort of nooks and crannies. Looks like a sponge. Something like that. So this would be the compact region, and this would be the spongy region. So it tends to have kind of a different thing. Now, what you have in there, that's the site of your bone marrow and things like that. So now when we get into, so that was a supportive group. So now when we get into the fluid connective tissue, there's two different types of fluid connective tissue, blood and lymph. Blood is basically the fluid matrix, essentially your plasma, right? So that's the clear fluid associated with your blood. And then in it are the formed elements. So these are the cells in your blood, red blood cells, white blood cells, things like that. So your formed elements basically are going to be red blood cells, whose job it is to carry oxygen to your body cells. You have white blood cells, which are actually part of your immune system. They fight off infection. And then you also have platelets, which are basically little chunks of cells. They're involved in blood clotting and coagulation. So this is kind of what it looks like in terms of your blood. So you have your plasma. That's all the yellow stuff right in here. That's plasma. You have your white blood cells, which are these guys right here. Different types of white blood cells with doing different types of defensive jobs. And then you have your red blood cells here, carrying oxygen to your cells. And then you have platelets, basically, that are kind of circulating throughout your bloodstream to coagulate and to clot the blood of any type of an injury or laceration in your blood vessels. Lymph is another type of fluid from extracellular tissues. And so it'll largely contain white blood cells. And then the lymphatic vessels are important because what they'll do is they'll mop up like a sponge. They act like a sponge. To take up excess tissue fluid. And it'll return it to the cardiovascular system. So your lymph is actually quite important. Okay, so that is all the connective tissue. Now let's take a look at muscular tissue. Remember, muscular tissue, its job is to contract. And so when you take a look at cells, muscles, and they have their own kind of terminology for these different cells. So their muscles are what we refer to as muscle fibers. So these essentially are muscle cells themselves, and they have everything that a cell would have in them, right? So they have, nucleus and ER and all that sort of stuff in them as well. We just call them muscle fibers. There's three different types, right? So there's going to be skeletal muscle, which is essentially the one, we'll talk more about that here in just a second, smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. So let's start with skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscle is essentially what's associated with contraction of the skeleton, right? Voluntary movement, ambulation. That means walking around, moving your body, right? So this is going to be attached to your skeleton by tendons. So each muscle will have a tendon that attaches it to the bone. And you basically move your skeleton with your skeletal muscles. Most of the skeletal muscles are the things that we are doing workouts for to increase bulk in. Typically speaking, in a skeletal muscle, your muscle cells themselves can be very long, and they can run the entire length of a muscle itself, but they also tend to be very cylindrical. And they could have multiple nuclei. So they look something like this, long and cylindrical. They can have multiple nuclei in them, and they can also be striated or striped in appearance. So you'll see these kind of like little stripes in skeletal muscle. Looks like that. And that's pretty typical. So this is kind of what it looks like. So here's a really good micrograph of it. Most of your body muscles, the ones that you're using to move your body. So here you can see, here's one nucleus, here's another nucleus, here's another nucleus, and you can see these stripes, these striations associated with the muscle itself. So typically very long and striated. Smooth muscles, on the other hand, don't have any striations. They're not long and cylindrical. They're spindle shaped. They kind of almost look like gummy worms. So they kind of look like these little, they kind of look something like that. And they sort of tend to sort of rest on top of each other. And they'll have one nucleus typically associated with them. They look something like this. This is typically for involuntary control. So basically, they align the organs. And it's associated with internal movements. Not under conscious control. So like blood vessel dilation, the way your digestive system moves around. So here's kind of what they look like. You can see they look kind of like a little bit of a river of like these little gummy worms. So you can see this particular image in particular was the one I was trying to draw. You can see the nuclei of the smooth muscle, but you can see this kind of much more kind of gummy worm-like river of smooth muscle. You'll see this around blood vessels, around organ walls, and things of that nature for involuntary movements. Then cardiac muscles only found in the walls of the heart. This is basically the heart is made up of cardiac muscle. It's also striated, similar to the skeletal muscle. It's involuntary, and it has typically a single nucleus. Generally speaking, the cells themselves are connected by intercalated discs, which basically marks the boundary of one cell to another and is full of gap junctions. Those little channels that connect one cell to another. That's kind of what it looks like. So here's your cardiac. So here's basically this little line right there. Those are intercalated discs. So here's your nucleus, one nucleus, and you can see how they're striated. They've got this little striping effect. The other thing also that's important about these guys as well is that they're basically kind of a net-like structure. They kind of form, let me put that one on this slide here. A net-like structure. What that basically means is one cell will basically bifurcate into two different directions. And then what it'll do is it'll interact and basically become part of another cell, which will bifurcate into two separate directions. This is an intercalated disc, an intercalated disc. Something like that. So you can kind of see they're basically interconnected with each other like that. And that's kind of true for these guys. So you can see like this guy right here, I'm going to put a little darker spot on this one. So this guy right here, you can see how he's kind of bifurcated here. So you can see you've got a continuous one coming in here, and then all of a sudden you kind of see there's a separation here between these two. So one is going down here and the other one is going up here. So if you were to pull those apart, that'd be different. And then here you can see another separation. So right there. So you can kind of see how they're a little kind of interconnected like a fishnet. Okay, so that's two tissues. Now let's go ahead and take a look at nervous tissue. So the nervous tissue is going to be basically conductive tissue. And so the idea is this is consisting of the primary ones, neurons, and its support group, neuroglia. Now, what it normally does is it'll take in sensory input, it'll do the integration of that sensory input, and it will be responsible for the motor output. So all those levels of communication, sensory integration, and then output, that's going to be done by the nervous tissue. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the poster boy for nervous tissue, and that is the neuron. The neuron is a cell, it's a very highly specialized cell. And so when you take a look at the neuron, It has a couple of main parts. First of all, it has what's called the dendrites. That's one piece of it. It's a communication piece. It has a cell body and it has an axon. Now, the dendrites themselves will carry information toward the cell body. So for instance, I have little hair-like extensions coming into what is otherwise a cell body, like this. So these will be the dendrites carrying information into the cell body. So the cell body will then process that information. And then that's kind of what's happening here. So here's the cell body. So the cell body, which is number 2, will be this main cell piece right there. And then what it'll do is it'll make some sort of a decision about what the proper output is based on what it just got from the dendrites. And then that will go basically through the axon, which is the third and last piece, which will be headed toward a target. So the outgoing message is processed by the cell body in response to the incoming messages, and then it will go out through the axon to its target to communicate to whoever it needs to communicate. Now, when you take a look at the axons, we can actually categorize neurons by the way their axons are structured. For instance, in some cases, axons will be covered by a fatty myelin sheath, which is actually, if you take a look at the axon, so here's like looking cross-section into the axon itself. Wrapped around the axon is actually another cell, and it basically wraps its membrane multiple times around that axon. So what you see is the axon, which is, I'm going to put an A in the middle of it, and then wrapping its membrane and itself around that axon is going to be this sheathing cell. I'm going to call it a sheathing cell. There's 2 different types of cells. There's what's called Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But what this does is it basically creates like an insulated wire. That's basically what it is. So it serves the same function as insulation on a wire. It basically kind of allows the axon to be able to communicate these electrical impulses down the axon. Now, generally speaking, whenever we have these sort of axons covered by the myelin sheath, we have them clustered together. We get a bundle of axons traveling either to the brain or through the spinal cord to your body. We call it a nerve. So a nerve is actually a bundle of axons themselves. Okay. So here's kind of what it looks like. This is a typical motor neuron. That means it's a neuron that's bringing some sort of a contraction signal to the body. And so you can see here, you've got basically the cell body right here. So this whole section right here is the cell body. And then you got a nucleus, you got all your organelles in here. The dendrites are all coming in and bringing in information to the cell body. The cell body has to organize itself and has to make sense and sort through all this information coming in. Then you have this little open area right here. It's kind of a little swelling area. It almost looks like the top of a funnel. This is what's called the axon hillock. And then basically your final message will go down the axon to its terminal spot, wherever that is. And you can see how it's basically covered by the sheathing cell. So here you can see is this myelinating cell. It basically has these little membrane extensions that kind of wraps around the axon cord and essentially creates this nice little thick layering, multiple layers of membrane, which we refer to as the myelin sheath. That's the reason why it's fatty, because the membrane is made out of phospholipid. It's a type of lipid. So those are the neurons. Now let's take a look at the supporting cast, right? So essentially the neuroglia. When you take a look at the nervous tissue, a lot of what you're going to see is neuroglia. It's like almost 10 times as much neuroglia as neurons themselves. And so they take up a good chunk of the volume of the brain. That's just the supportive functions. And so their job is to support the neurons and to nourish the neurons. So that's their job. Okay. And they do that in different ways. And we'll dig more into that when we get into the neurophysiology chapters. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at the last of the tissue chapters, epithelial tissue. So the epithelial tissue is generally made of very tightly packed cells with significant connections between them, and they tend to be liners. So this is basically liners and glands. That's basically what epithelial tissue does. So it'll line your body cavities, it'll cover your body surfaces, and of course, it'll be glandular as well. Generally speaking, when you take a look at epithelial tissue, there is a common structure to it. Generally, there is going to be what's called an apical space and a basal space anchored by a basal membrane. So let's take a look then at a group of cells. So I'm going to draw what's called simple squamous cells. So here's my little cell layer. I'm going to connect these guys together with cell connections, maybe adhesion junctions, for instance. So here's my connected cells together. Now, generally speaking, whenever you have cells in a line like this, you can't just have them floating around there in free space, right? They have to be basically tethered to some sort of like a foundational matrix. And the most minimal matrix is what's referred to as the basement membrane. So the basement membrane, think of it as sort of like physiological tack paper that you can stick underneath that free liner of cells. So this creates a connective tissue foundation for epithelial tissue. And so when you take a look at an epithelial layer, you have two different surfaces. You have the surface of the cell that's in contact with the basement membrane. So down here, you would have what's called the basal layer in contact with the basement membrane. Up here, you would have what's called the apical layer, what's in contact with the free space. And so generally speaking, when we take a look at epithelial tissue, we name it for the shape and also the number of layers. For instance, simple epithelium is basically a single layer of cells, so one layer. If we say it's stratified, it has multiple layers of cells. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So here is one layer, and then here is multiple layers. Now notice how we define a layer, basically, is essentially the same cell has both apical and basal surface. So for instance, here's one cell layer. If we take a look at this one individual cell right here, you see there's an apical surface here. Okay, that's good. That same cell, if you kind of go down here, is also in possession of the basal surface. So the same cell has both apical and basal surfaces. That's one layer. In this case, you can see that you have one cell layer with the basal, but a different cell layer has the apical. That means it's stratified. There's two different layers there. Now, pseudostratified sometimes looks stratified, but it's actually not. So for instance, even though here you can see this little cell right there has a basal, it does not have an apical. That suggests it's stratified, but in reality it's not, because this guy right here has both apical and basal. This guy right here has both apical and also has basal. So you can see that there's several of them that have both. The other way that we can organize them is by shape. So the shape that we have there's three shapes. There's what's called squamous, which is basically flat. Okay, so it's kind of like just a flat cell like that, like a pancake. It can be cuboid, so basically it's kind of like a three-dimensional cube. It's roughly kind of the way it looks, not identically, but perfectly, but somewhat like a cube. And then we have columnar, so they tend to be long and cylindrical like this. Okay, so cubes tend to be a little bit more boxy and shorter, and squamous tend to be flatter. So then when we actually name the epithelium, we can name it as compound name, part shape and part layering. So for instance, simple squamous is going to be a single layer because it's simple, of flattened cells because it's squamous. Typically speaking, we tend to see these in the liners of organs. So for instance, we see it in lungs, we see it on the inside of blood vessels and things like that. So they tend to be very narrow because there's not a lot of physical strain on them. So they're typically what I refer to as physiological types of layers. They're designed to be involved in physiology, not in physical strain. We also have simple cuboid, which is a single layer because it's simple. Cuboids because it's cube-shaped cells. And oftentimes these simple cuboids will be involved in glands, right? So here's a good example of simple squamous. So you can see this is the epithelium of the inside of the lungs. You can see your basement membrane and your apical surface, so that's going to be one cell. Simple cuboid, it's the same sort of a thing. In this case, you can see the cuboid wheel, so this is basically the lining of the kidneys. So you can see these more cuboid-looking cells. You can see here's the basement membrane. And of course, that right there is the apical surface. So you can see that's one layer of simple cuboid cells. Now we also have simple columnar, which is a single layer of column-shaped cells. So basically that's going to be just something that looks like this. And then of course we saw before the pseudostratified layer, which is this guy right here. That's going to be a type of columnar. Oops, where'd it go? That's going to be a type of columnar cell, right? Because ultimately it's the appears to be stratified, but it's not. So it appears to be stratified, but it's not. And we sort of did that analysis on the previous slide. Oftentimes, we see this in a respiratory tract where our cilia are moving mucus across the surface. Here's what it looks like. So here's your simple columnar. So you can see, basically you have the apical surface. I'm just going to put an A for apical. And then you can see the basal surface over here, and that's true for each one of them. So you can see how the nuclei tend to line up in a nice little orderly fashion. And sometimes what you'll see is like these guys right here. So those types of cells right there, what's called goblet cells, they're making a big old ball of mucus. And so what they'll do is they'll secrete the mucus on the outside here to kind of create kind of a gooey gum. So this is what happens in your intestines, sort of kind of to kind of grease the sled, so to speak. And then pseudostratified columnar looks stratified because it looks like you have one row here and another row here, but in reality, you see a cell that's in contact with both apical and basal, which means that it's actually simple. But you also see these goblet cells in here. So what you do is you have these cilia in here that will form this sort of mucus layer. And what happens is when dust particles get inhaled, it gets trapped in your mucus, and your cilia will sweep that dust particle up into your cough zone so you cough it out. Okay. And so that's kind of like your columnar. Now then, when you take a look at simple epithelium, let's take a look at the glandular effect. So far we've been talking mostly about liners, but now we want to talk a little bit about glands. So when we take a look at glands, the idea here is that you're going to be secreting some sort of a product. You're going to be getting something out. And so there's two different types of glands that we see. There's what's called exocrine or outside, and endocrine, which means inside. Typically an exocrine is a situation where you secrete it into a duct-like system. Like for instance, your pancreas secretes digestive enzymes into the pancreatic duct. Endocrine glands is when you dump that directly into the bloodstream. Another example from the pancreas is basically the pancreas can also secrete, because it's got both functions, insulin into the bloodstream. So it's an endocrine function. And that goes directly into the bloodstream. So generally speaking, if you're an exocrine gland, you have a ducted network. If you are an endocrine gland, you dump your secretions directly into the bloodstream. Now, generally speaking, whenever you see stratified epithelia, you're basically looking at several different layers, multiple layers. So for instance, stratified squamous epithelium is oftentimes what we see in the outer skin. It also lines the mouth, right? Because these are, and the esophagus. Why? Because these are under mechanical stress. Lots of chafing. So you need extra thickness to sort of protect yourself. And then you have transitional epithelium, which basically changes shape in response to tension. You typically find this in your urinary bladder. So when your bladder is relaxed, it's one shape. When it's extended, when it's full, it's a different shape. So it stretches. Okay, so this is kind of like what stratified squamous looks like. So you can see here, you've got this thickness of squamous material. So this is all that thick, multiple layers of squamous tissue. And the important thing to understand is a lot of times what will happen is once you get down here to the basement membrane, you get the basal layer. Oftentimes these deeper layers almost look kind of cuboid in nature, but they're not. It's only because of the physical stress of the layers on top of them that the shape starts to distort. So when you're taking a look at the cell shape, you always look at the top, the apical surface. Whatever that is what it is throughout. You can't change your cell shape midway through. So if you start off squamous, you stay squamous. It doesn't matter if these basal layers look kind of cuboid in nature. It's just only because of the physical stress of the other layers on top of them that causes their shape to distort and gets a little confusing. But you always do your diagnosis from the top, from the apical surface. So then let's go ahead and take a look at systems and cavities and membranes. So our organs basically are a group of tissues that are doing a common thing. And of course, they're going to be members of an organ system, for instance, respiratory system. They typically live inside a cavity. And so we have different types of cavities in us that will basically allow us to organize our organs. And so when we take a look at our anatomical terms, I want to move through this section quickly, mostly because it's just for reference and orientation. But essentially, we use some of the standard terms for anatomical parts and things like that. For instance, whenever we take a look at our references to looking at organisms by region, we always use an individual who's standing upright, facing forward with their palms pointing outward and their thumbs pointing away from them. That's what's called anatomical position. So from that position, then, we have a couple of different regional and sort of orientation terms. First of all, we have ventral versus anterior, which refers to the front. So the ventral surface is your chest, or it's the anterior. The back is going to be your dorsal or your posterior. So that's going to be your backside. So the dorsal, I always tell students, just think of the dorsal fin on a shark. So a shark swimming around here with the dorsal fin, it's always on their back, so that's on their dorsal side. Superior means up, inferior means below. So superior aspect is above, inferior aspect is below. Oftentimes it means toward the head or toward the feet, depending on the organism you're looking at. There's a couple of other types of positional things, like for instance, when you hear the term medial, it means that you're closer to the midline of the body. Lateral means that you're further away from the midline of the body. So here's a good example. So in an anatomical position with my thumbs pointing away from my body, I could say that my pinky is medial, my thumbs are lateral, so they're kind of further away. Okay. There's also another set of terms that oftentimes confuses students, and it's proximal distal. So basically, this essentially means that you're either close to or you're far away from a reference point. In this case, we're using the trunk of the body. So for instance, if you take a look at anatomical position, I could say that I have two different structures I want to compare. I'm going to take a look at the wrist, and then I'm going to take a look at my shoulder. I could say my shoulder is proximal because it's closer to the trunk of my body. And my wrists are distal because it's further away from the trunk of my body. So proximal and distal simply just means it's far away or it's nearby. Generally speaking, organ systems will oftentimes work together. As a matter of fact, we study the organ systems separately, but in reality, they work almost as a continuum. So they're actually blurred together. And you'll see that as we kind of move forward. But here's the organ systems that we have. We're going to take a look at. We have the integument system, which basically protects the body. It's our liner. Our cardiovascular system, which basically transports nutrients, waste, and oxygen. We also have our lymphatic and immune system, which essentially is associated with fluid support, fluid balance, and also our immune system defense. Digestive system is purpose of ingesting, breaking down, and digesting and absorption of nutrients and elimination. Respiratory system is for gas exchange, oxygen, CO2, on the most part, and the urinary system is for excretion and elimination of waste. Our skeletal system is for support. Our muscular system is for movement. Our nervous system is for coordination of all these different systems in the body. Our endocrine system is another coordination system, only it's a chemical coordination system. And then, of course, our reproductive system is to reproduce. And so those are basically our organ systems. So now let's take a look at the cavities. We have two really main cavities. We have what's called the ventral, the stomach side, or the dorsal. The ventral cavity, or the coelom, if like you were in early development or in zoology, this basically means cavity. Basically, this it contains the main cavities that we'll be talking about. So you have your thoracic cavity, you have your abdominal cavity, and your pelvic cavities. Those are all in the ventral cavity. Typically, the diaphragm will separate between thoracic and abdominal. And in the thoracic, we have the lungs and the heart. So we'll talk more about that when we get to cardiovascular and respiratory. In the abdominal cavity, we have the digestive system. So stomach, liver, pancreas, gallbladder, things of that nature. Large intestine, small intestines. So their pelvic cavity, which is just below the abdominal cavity, will then house the lower portion of our bladder, and our reproductive organs. And then, of course, on the external side, only males have external. The scrotum will actually house the external portion of the reproductive system, the testes. The dorsal cavity is largely the brain, cranial cavity, and the vertebral canal. And so that's kind of the way we break it down. So here you can see this is going to be your ventral cavity. So these are the main ones. So let me put a star next to the main ones that we'll see here. Thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic. Those are going to be the biggies that we're going to talk about the most. And then you can see your posterior or your dorsal cavities are your cranial cavity where your brain resides, and then of course the vertebral canal where your spinal cord goes down. So that's going to be referred to as your posterior dorsal cavity. When you take a look, in this case, at your anterior cavity, you can see here that your thoracic cavity can be broken up. So your thoracic cavity is this large bell-like structure that's broken up into a couple of different pieces. So you notice that you have little subcavities here. So like this one right here is going to be what's called your pleural cavities. That houses your lungs. In the middle of the lungs is what's called the mediastinum, which itself is broken up into an upper region here and a lower region, which houses your heart, and that's the pericardial cavity. Then you have your diaphragm right here. And then you have your abdominal cavity, which houses all of your stomach, small intestines, and so forth. And then below your abdominal cavity, you have your pelvic cavity, where you're going to find your reproductive organs. So we'll take a closer look at how those are broken up as we get to those cavities. But before we get there, I want to lay some of the groundwork here, because remember we said that epithelial tissue lines cavities. And that's true. And they line the cavities in the form of what's called membranes. And so we have a couple of different types of membranes in the body. Number one, we have the mucous membranes. Then we have what's called serous membranes. We have synovial membranes. And then we have what's referred to as a special type of membrane system called the meninges. So let's take a look at each one of these in turn. So the mucous membranes are essentially, remember, they're liners. So this is all epithelium. If you're wondering where this resides in the four tissue spectrum, this is epithelial tissue. So it lines basically the tubes of the digestive system, the respiratory tract, the urinary system, and the reproductive systems. And so their job is to essentially secrete mucus. That's what they do for a living. So they contain lots of goblet cells in their epithelium. And typically that epithelium is founded on loose fibrous connective tissue for essentially support. So this is in addition to the basement membrane. So their job is to secrete mucus. That's why they're called mucous membranes. Serous membranes are a little bit different, because serous membranes will basically line cavities that typically aren't open to the environment. And you have a couple of different types of this, right? For instance, you have different names. The pleural liners are essentially going to be lining the pleural cavities, that is the lung cavities. The pericardium lines the pericardial cavity, right? It forms a pericardial sac and it covers the heart, which is embedded inside that pericardial cavity. And then the peritoneum, which then doubles on itself and is called mesenteries, are basically multiple layers of the serous membrane that wraps essentially the digestive organs. And it kind of bundles them up, if you will, okay? And so we'll take a little closer look at that structurally as we get to those particular chapters. And then the synovial membranes are basically mostly loose connective tissue. That's kind of what they're composed of. But these are in the movable joints, like your hinge joints and things like that. Their job is to simply secrete synovial fluid. We'll see this when we take a look at joints. So it's lubrication, like your knee joints, for instance. And then meninges are special. So these guys are kind of specialized cases of membranes. The meninges are special because they're only going to be in that dorsal cavity, right? That posterior cavity. They're going to be found in the brain and in the spinal cord. And so what happens is the meninges essentially form and line the nervous systems, I'm just going to say the nervous system for lack of a better term, the nervous system cavities. And if you get an inflammation of these liners, that becomes meningitis. Okay. And so now let's go ahead and take a look at the integument system. So the integument basically is the first of the systems. It's essentially human skin plus other stuff. So it has structurally a couple of different pieces to it. It's got what's called epidermis, which means upon the dermis, which is the skin. And of course, it's got the dermis. And in addition to this, it doesn't just have the epidermis of the dermis, it also has accessory organs as well, which are associated. So let's take a look at it. So in the skin, you have accessory organs. One of those is going to be hair. Then you have nails. And you have different types of glands. And so the job of all of this is essentially of the integument system is to protect your underlying tissues from trauma, from bacterial invasion, and also from water loss. So you can imagine how difficult life would be if you just had pure muscle exposed to the outside world. You'd be losing water dramatically, very fast. Your muscles would be drying out. It'd be very difficult. Pathogens would be able to attack your body quickly, and you would be very close to your blood vessels, so you'd probably bleed out very easily. It also allows you to regulate body temperature. So this is another one that people oftentimes don't really think about, but this is a really huge one. Sensory reception. So there's a lot of receptors in your skin, touch, heat, things like that, that allows you to be able to interface with your environment. As a matter of fact, it is the main way that you can interact with your environment and sort of discern the nature of your environment. And of course, by that, it makes us aware of our surroundings. So anybody who's ever had extended numbness in their skin knows just how difficult it is to navigate your environment because you're not quite sure when you're touching things, like how to process that. Like, well, is it hot? Is it cold? Am I putting too much pressure, not enough pressure? So a lot of these skin sensors are really helping us to sort of gauge and navigate and get through our physical environment and to be able to bring in sensory information from our physical environment itself. So when we take a deeper look, however, at our integument system, it basically contains all of the 4 tissue types. It really is a complex organ and complex system. So when you take a look at the first 2 main regions, the epidermis and the dermis, we're going to start there. We're going to take a look at the subcutaneous layer, which is below the dermis, in just a second. So first of all, the epidermis and the dermis. The hypodermis is essentially below. It's mostly fat, and it's kind of where you connect the skin to the bone and the muscle. So this is kind of what it looks like. I would suggest that you kind of get comfortable with this. And so you can see the structure. So first of all, at the very top, you can see of the epidermis, which is broken into multiple layers of epithelial cells. And then the dermis, which is really big, it's connective tissue. So lots of connective tissue and also lots of extra things in there. Lots of sensory receptors in there, lots of muscles, your hair molecules. So all the really cool stuff in your skin is to be found in your dermis. And then underneath, you can see the subcutaneous layer, which is typically subcutaneous fat. And so that's kind of like the supportive layer. So if you kind of start picking up some fat, then that's where it's going to be deposited subcutaneously. So let's start taking a look at the epidermis. So this is the thinnest region and the outermost region of the skin. It's stratified squamous. Why? Because of the increased mechanical stress. So you simply just need that because you're rough on your skin, right? So since you're always constantly scraping off skin and you're losing skin, you need stem cells to basically replace the old sloughed off cells. And so you're constantly replacing them. So they're injured or they're shed, but basically you have to replace. And so generally speaking, that's a constant process. If you have an injury where you need a little bit of help there, you can get what's called an autograft, which is basically taking skin from another area of the body and allowing it the growth factors in order to grow new skin. Or allograft is from another person, where you take a skin graft from oftentimes a cadaver, and that will allow you to sort of build off of their skin cells as well. And now we're starting to grow skin in labs, so we can use that. So let's take a look at the cells of the epidermis. What's in there? First of all, the main piece is going to be keratinocytes. These are basically cells that are dead, and they're filled with keratin. This is kind of like a cement-like protein. So it's almost kind of like what would happen is if you just basically replaced yourself, hollowed yourself out, and replaced yourself with cement. You would make a great sculpture, but you would be thoroughly dead. So these oftentimes will create a fairly waterproof barrier, and so that's kind of why they're helpful. They'll create a nice little barrier. In addition to that, you have what's called the Langerhans cells. These are a type of white blood cells that basically defend against pathogens. And then you have melanocytes, which produce melanin, which is your skin pigment. And this is what produces skin color. And what it does is your skin pigments will actually protect you from UV light. So it's a good thing to have melanin. And so ultimately, when you take a look at people, they all have the same number of melanocytes, that is the cells that make the pigment. But the amount of melanin varies because different melanocytes will be able to deposit or make more or less melanin. Okay. So other contributors to skin color other than your melanin is going to be keratin, so which is kind of an orangish color, and hemoglobin, which is kind of a reddish color. Organ, no. So those will affect skin color as well. The important thing also about epidermal cells is they're the source of vitamin D production. So basically, you will produce vitamin D when you expose yourself to UV radiation. And vitamin D is really critical in the regulation, along with your kidneys, of calcium and phosphorus. So you need vitamin D. That's the reason why you need a little bit of sunlight. Okay, so that's all important things that are happening in your epidermis. In your dermis, this is going to be your thick inner layer of skin. It's going to be fibrous, dense, fibrous connective tissue. What does that mean? That means it is collagenous and structural. So it contains a lot of collagen. It contains elasticity for flexibility, because your skin has to be able to flex and stretch. It also contains all the good stuff, the blood vessels, the sensory receptors, the glands, all those things that we usually think about, like, for instance, our ability to discern touch and pressure, pain, hot, cold, all those sorts of things. But those are all located in the dermis. The dermis, by the way, if you're wondering, is the leather. So for those of you who tan leather, you have that tough, leathery piece, and you maybe make clothing out of it. The leather is actually the dermis of the organism. So then below the dermis, we have the subcutaneous level, which technically is not part of the skin. It's the first part that's not part of the skin, but sometimes we lump it in there anyway. This is loose connective tissue. It's all adipose tissue mostly. You also see there's other things going there, blood vessels and things like that going there as well. But largely we use this area for insulation. So like, for instance, when animals pick up that layer of blubber for overwintering, they pack it into their subcutaneous layer. This also protects us, right? So fat protects the underlying muscles and organs and things like that, even more so. And then, of course, it's an energy storage because fats are a very energetic molecule that we can utilize for energy. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the accessory organs. First of all, skin, nail, hair, and glands. First of all, nails. Let's take a look at this. So nails are protective. That's what they're supposed to be. They're a protective covering for your fingers and your toes. And so ultimately what happens is the nails will grow from what's called a nail root. That's basically where the base of your fingernail is, where the moons are. And that's kind of where we call, that covers essentially what's called the nail bed. The cuticle, which is that layer of skin on the nail root, is kind of what we oftentimes will sort of in and a manicurist will kind of peel those back a little bit, right? That's a little layer of skin that's on your nail. So this is your nail. Let's say there's your moon right there. And then your cuticle is that little flap of skin that basically is right there at your nail bed. And then the lunula is going to be this little half moon area. Okay. And so that's basically how your nail looks. So here's what it looks like. So you can see here's your cuticle right here. And then you see your lunula or the moon. And then we have the nail body, which is the bulk of the nail on the finger. And of course, we have the leading edge of the nail itself. Now, underneath, if you were to take a cross section of your finger, you would see that you have your nail is growing out, very similar to your skin. So this layering right here that we see right there is very similar to how the epidermal cells grow. So in this case, instead of just creating these sort of like keratin-filled skin cells, what it does is it basically almost creates pure keratin, and that becomes this hard shell. And then that starts to grow outward as it's being replaced. So it's constantly adding. So if you were to blow this region up, you have your nail right here. What's happening is this nail bed right here, this is where the new cells are being made. So it's constantly making new nail matrix like this in concentric rings. So basically what happens is as they add a new layer, it pushes the nail forward and it grows out. So you're constantly adding new nail material underneath your cuticle. So now let's take a look at the hair. So we basically have hair follicles, right? These are epidermal structures that surround the hair itself. So the follicles themselves are like a shaft. The shaft portion of the hair is protruding from the skin itself. And then, of course, the color of the hair comes from melanin as well. So it deposits on the hair. So melanocytes basically will deposit at the base, and then that colors the hair. As we get older, generally speaking, what happens is these melanocytes produce less pigment because the stem cells responsible for making melanocytes start to die and they just don't reproduce anymore. And then you don't have any more pigment to add to the hair, so it turns out gray, starts coming out gray or white. Attached to the hair shaft is going to be what's called the erector pili muscles. So these guys are the goosebump muscles. So when they contract, they'll cause your hair to stand on end, and that'll create goosebumps. A couple of other accessory organs of the skin. You have oil glands called sebaceous glands. So this basically secretes a structure, a substance called sebum, which is kind of an oil-like material. And then that'll basically coat your skin or your hair. So it's kind of like natural conditioner. For our hair and for our skin. It also has a little bit of antibacterial to it. And then it's also the source, unfortunately, of acne, because whenever we have an inflamed sebaceous gland, it becomes infected, and then the white blood cells attack, and then you start to develop dead white blood cells, which is pus, and that's the acne pus associated with it. We also have in here sweat glands or sudoriferous glands. So these are in the dermis, and their ducts will go up into the surface of the skin and sort of release. So it basically kind of looks like this. And then the duct will go up to the surface of the skin, and then it'll basically release sweat on the surface of the skin. This helps us to regulate our body temperature by basically evaporates and takes the heat away. Just like an evaporative cooler, or when your skin, you spray water on yourself and the cool breeze sort of makes you feel cool. It's the same exact thing. Sweat's happening the same way. It's taking the excess heat from your body, and it's taking that with its as it's being evaporated off by the cool air. So now let's go ahead and take a look at homeostasis. And this is going to be one of the last topics that we have of the chapter. So we'll take a look at homeostasis. So basically, with homeostasis, what homeostasis is essentially the maintenance of constant internal environment. And so there's lots of different conditions in the body that need to be maintained in order for you to be able to be functional physiologically. For instance, you need to maintain good homeostasis, normal internal conditions with your blood glucose, with pH, with body temperature, things of that nature. Too much of these or too little of these can be a bad thing. So there's a couple of parts of this, right? So ultimately, when you take a look at your internal environment, you have two main regions. So you have the blood, which is part of your cardiovascular system, and you have interstitial fluid, which is part of your tissues. So blood is going to be basically delivering oxygen and nutrients to the tissues, and it's going to be carrying away carbon dioxide and wastes. And so when you have interstitial fluid, it basically surrounds your body cells and essentially will exchange substances through it. That's how it communicates with the blood. So the body systems work together to keep these substances sort of in normal. So you have to constantly deliver oxygen, constantly pick up waste and things like that. So the nervous system and the endocrine system coordinate all these activities. So for instance, the nervous system is typically faster, whereas the endocrine system is longer and is a bit more of a long-term maintenance strategy. Endocrine basically functions on hormones, whereas the nervous system functions on neural impulses. And so this is kind of like in kind of homeostasis by organ. So the nervous system is a regulator and a coordinator, as is the endocrine system, which is a regulator and coordinator. The respiratory system will supply oxygen and take up CO2. The cardiovascular system will transport that oxygen and the nutrients to the cells. The digestive system supplies the blood with nutrients for those tissue cells. The urinary system will excrete the nitrogenous wastes associated with what the system picked up. The lymphatic system will maintain your blood volume and also your fluid in your tissues to make sure they're not getting swollen. The integument will basically maintain your body temperature and keep an internal thermostat, if you will, of your overall body temperature. And of course, your muscular system will produce heat if your core body temperature starts to drop, and that's also homeostatic. So you have a lot of delivery, two major homeostatic pathways in terms of temperature maintenance and also nutrients and waste. And then we have ways to regulate that. So we have what's called feedback loops, so mechanisms for positive and negative feedback loop. A negative feedback loop is a situation where you have a system that kind of shuts itself down. So for instance, typically speaking, whenever you have a mechanism in the body, you typically will have what's called a sensor. So you have to know when things are kind of getting out of whack. So a good example of a homeostatic norm would be essentially what happens is as your, let's say, blood pressure increases, there are homeostatic mechanisms that turn on to turn that curve back down. And when it troughs, there's mechanism that turn on to turn that back up and so forth. And so basically homeostatically, you're oscillating around what is called a homeostatic norm. Now, if you start to get a little too high, that's where all of your feedback. So you have to run into a negative feedback loop that shuts itself down. So the first thing you need with negative feedback is a sensor. You need to know when it's out of control. Then you need to send that sensory information to a control center. That control center then needs to figure out some sort of an output, which then turns the system down or off of its production. So how a furnace works, right? So basically the thermostat has sensors that determines whether or not the temperature is getting too high. The temperature is getting too high, it has a mechanism that sort of sends it to the control center, which then turns on the air conditioner to kind of bring that temperature back up. And so that's basically how temperature regulation works. I use the example of blood pressure. But homeostasis is this constant sort of oscillation like a tide, ebb and flow of a tide in and out. And then if you get beyond that, you have to have these feedback loops in order to sort of bring yourself back into homeostasis. So that's kind of what it looks like in general. So imagine that you have either a tilt one way or the other of homeostasis. So that basically means you have some sort of a stimulus, the out of bounds nature of the homeostatic disturbance. That's picked up by some sort of a sensor, and you have sensors throughout your body controlling and regulating and sensing all of these different types of parameters. It's going to send that information to a control center, typically your brain or a region of your brain. And then that control center is going to sort through all the information, make sense of it all, and determine what the correct direct response is to that stimulus. In which case, it's going to send that out back through the nervous system to the effector. So basically the effect is some sort of a response in your body that will then have the effect of bringing back down your homeostatic cycle or your homeostatic disturbance, getting yourself back under homeostasis. So that's kind of what a negative feedback situation looks like. So it's like a thermostat. So here basically we have our stimulus, which is in this case is too hot, rising heat. And so the sensor picks that up. It sends that information to the control center. It's set at 68. And so that control center says, if it's this, then do this. And that do this is to basically turn off the furnace. And once it turns off the furnace, then basically it's going to shut itself down, and that's going to bring you back under homeostatic control. The same thing happens when it's too cold. If it goes down to 66, now it's too cold. So the sensor sends that information to the control center. The control center makes a decision, okay, now we need to turn the furnace on. That furnace is going to put out hot air, which is then going to warm your temperature back up to 68, and that's eventually going to fix your homeostasis. So you can see you basically have kind of a negative feedback situation. And so this is kind of the way it works. So in the body, we have a similar sort of a situation, in which case we have something happening, a disturbance. In this case, you're looking at body temperature, a disturbance of body temperature. The stimulus is sent to the brain, which is the sensor, is sensed by the brain. And then that information goes to a specific region in the brain, the hypothalamus, which is the control center. So the hypothalamus is like right in there. And so that then sends out a direct response to, in this case, your skin, causes the blood vessel to dilate because that's where all the hot is in your blood. You're hot-blooded. And your sweat glands, so it's going to cause you to sweat so you can cool off. And all those will turn on. That'll basically shed excess heat, and that'll bring your core body temperature back down to normal. On the flip side of things, you could get too cold. If you get too cold, your stimulus is going to go to your hypothalamus. You have sensors saying, ooh, it's getting a little cold here. It's going to go to your hypothalamus, which is then going to make some sort of a decision that now what needs to happen is you need to constrict your blood vessels so you don't lose your heat. You want to preserve it, and you want not to sweat. You also may shiver. That's your skeletal muscles contracting involuntarily so that you can generate body heat. That should bring up your core body temperature back up to homeostatic norm. So you can see then how you have these sort of this thermostat-like homeostatic mechanisms to try to maintain homeostasis. So that's a good example of negative feedback. Positive feedback essentially is something that brings about change in the same direction. For instance, in childbirth, right? The fetus's head starts to push against the cervix, which basically starts to stretch the uterine lining. This stimulates a signal within the uterus that's sent to the brain, and the brain secretes what's called oxytocin. And so this basically causes contraction. But what happens is oxytocin causes stronger contractions of the uterine lining, but the contractions themselves will send signals to secrete more oxytocin. More oxytocin will cause more contractions will cause oxytocin. So you can see this kind of like cyclic piece. So causing more oxytocin can be released, and then the childbirth stops after the child is out. Why? Because there's no more stretch. So childbirth stops, the positive feedback, because there's no more uterine stretch. The baby's out. Right, so this is kind of like an example of a positive feedback loop. Okay, so that is basically the lump sum of chapter 4. And next week we will start with chapter